Welcome to Nurturing Relationships, our brand new 6-week course, taking lessons and exploring Jewish wisdom for building deeper and richer connection in all of our relationships. Before we actually get started with the course, I just want to do a few housekeeping announcements. As you know, if you're here today, that means that the emails are working. But if you did not receive the email, then make sure that you are by getting in touch with me. Maybe it's going to your spam folder. Maybe I don't have your email address down properly, because those emails are important. You can expect an email reminding you about 9-10 o'clock in the morning each Monday, reminding you of each of the 6 lessons. Today is lesson number 1, and as we go through the 6 weeks. And then you can expect a follow-up email at about 9:30 p.m. that evening, which will include a video recording of this lesson here, as well as different references and links that we reference throughout the lesson, throughout the class, that can be very helpful to you. The structure of the course, for those of you that are new here, I know live on the Zoom we don't have anybody new, but watching the recording, I'm sure we will have some people that are new. The structure of the course works as follows. We work our way through the textbook, which looks like this. Your registration includes a textbook like this. If you're only taking the Zoom or the YouTube option, make sure you stop by Chabad Pasadena to pick this up, or arrange with me for it to be mailed to your house. This textbook has many texts that we will be reading throughout each lesson. And the format of the class is that we go through those texts by going around either physically the room or the virtual Zoom room and asking people to read. If you don't want to read, that's okay. Just wave me on and we'll move on. Throughout the lessons, there are exercises. So it's always good to have a pen handy. That pen is also useful because I usually don't take questions if we're in the middle of a flow, but we have different breaks when we do questions. And if you don't write down the question as it occurs to you, then often it'll slide right out of your brain and you'll forget about it. But if you write it down, then when we do have a break, you can bring up that question, we can discuss it. Of course, the main purpose of the follow-up email that I mentioned earlier is so that you can also ask questions that way. You can hit the reply button. You can tell me what a great class it was, what a horrible class it was, what you would have done if you were giving the class, or just ask a question or schedule a phone call so we can talk a little bit more as a follow-up to that day's lesson. I'm always available for those kind of follow-ups. Thank you. Thank you. We are ready to begin. And I don't think there's anything else that we need to discuss as part of our housekeeping. But before we begin, I wanted to welcome you to lesson 1. Today's lesson is called The Art of Empathy. And let me explain what the framework of today's lesson will be, which will also help you understand the framework of the entire course. So today's lesson is going to be divided into 3 sections. The first section is going to be the course objective. We're going to take about 10 minutes to discuss what exactly the objective of the course is. We will then take about 35 to 40 minutes to discuss section 2 of this lesson. Will be the general approach to relationships from the Torah. We're going to call it soul connection. And that will kind of give us the general idea of how the Torah views relationships as a whole. And then finally, in the remaining 45 minutes of the lesson, we will tackle the art of empathy, the tool that we will be unpacking for this week, because that is the general structure of the course. The course is structured into 6 lessons, and each of those lessons is designed to help you either learn or most likely enhance your learning, enhance your already appreciation of 6 different tools that are not just required, they're crucial for any relationship to flourish. And they are also the names of the lessons. So lesson 1 will be the art of empathy. Next week we'll do the art of listening, followed by the art of disagreeing. Lesson 4 will be the art of positivity, followed by the art of influence. And finally, with lesson 6, we will conclude with the art of forgiveness. So today, the art of empathy will be the second half of today's lesson, the last 45 minutes of the lesson. Each lesson is about 90 minutes. So that's the amount of time that you can expect each lesson to take, and I think we are ready to dive into it. So welcome to lesson 1, the art of empathy. Today's class is available to be sponsored. Each lesson is available to be sponsored. If you'd like to do so, please reach out to me. We'd love to have you on board for that. So what is the course objective? We are going to open with a text on page 3. in your student book. And it's a text that is basically a verse from the Torah, from Genesis, directly from the opening parasha of the entire Torah. We already read this 2 weeks ago, and we're still fresh, or 2.5 weeks ago. We're still fresh in the beginning of starting the Torah, and yet we already read this verse. Ron, you want to read it for us, please? Text 1: No to loneliness.
God, God said, "It is not good for the human to be alone. I shall make for him a corresponding counterpart."
Okay, thank you very much. This verse, of course, discusses Adam's need to marry. The Torah tells us that Adam observed that every other creature was created a male and a female, and he didn't have a partner, and he actually complained to God. Anyways, lots of discussion about it, etc. And of course, this verse is the opening to marriage. But our sages understand this verse. This has long been noted by many different commentary that it actually implies much more than marriage. It implies that a human being, as the Rambam, as Maimonides puts it in his Moreh Nevuchim, in his Guide for the Perplexed, he says, Ki ha'adam hu medini, that a human being is a social creature. And that in order for a human being to flourish, a human being needs relationships, not just marriage. In fact, I would argue that in order for a marriage to flourish, other relationships are necessary. There is a wide range of people that we have relationships throughout our lives. Of course, we have relationships with our spouses if we are married, but we also have relationships with our parents and with our children. We have relationships with our siblings, extended family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, community members, those that sit in shul next to us, the person who always sits at my table, the person who never sits at my table, the person who sits next to me at the Kiddush, all of these different people, right? Including the people, by the way, with which we just sometimes have transactions. You're the person behind the counter at your cleaners, right? The person you always seem to see because you guys have back-to-back appointments at your doctor or back-to-back appointments at your therapist or whatever it is, right? There are lots of different people that we have relationships with in our lives, and that plethora of relationships is actually needed in order for human beings to thrive. As a result, this course is not going to be so much about marriage. We can talk more about that soon. It's going to be about, in general, the importance and the tools that are necessary in order for a human being to have relationships as a whole. It will apply to marriage as well, but we're going to talk in much broader strokes and in much more general terms, and you can apply it to all of the different relationships. Now, given that we have this verse where the Torah tells us how important it is for a human being not to be alone and to actually have relationships with other people, you shouldn't just be a loner at home. I don't need friends. I don't need relationships with other people. But you actually should pursue relationships, right? So it follows that, number one, the Torah would shape, number one, the underlying attitude for how to have authentic and real and healthy relationships, but also the Torah would give us actionable pearls of advice, practical tips for how to actually achieve those relationships that we need. Guidance is needed, I think, and we're on page 4 here if you'd like to join me, because building and maintaining relationships can very, very often be challenging. And I'm not going to ask you to share the results. As you know, I often ask you to share results from your exercises, but this is not one that I will ask you to share. But I think that it will be useful to you throughout the entire course if you can identify for yourself 3 typical relationship stressors for you. There are typical relationship stressors across the board, right? But trying to encapsulate it in just a word or two, if you can put down some of the common relationship stressors that you encounter in your relationships, I think it will be useful to you throughout the course to be able to better them. Please hold just 1 second, because apparently not everybody received my email, so I'm getting some text messages of people who want to come in. But meanwhile, let's do that exercise. So again, that's on page 4. Identify 3 typical relationship stressors. I'm trying to put them down in a word or two. How do I, okay. Give me 1 second. Because just one person is trying to get in with their phone and it doesn't seem to be working. All right. So hopefully that will work for them. If not, I won't really be able to troubleshoot that much. Okay. The real, right? So now that we have some of those relationship stressors, the things that are constantly affecting our relationships, I think now we can move on to actionable tips for how to actually deal with those. So we're going to start with the Torah's general approach to relationships. And I want to stress something, by the way. Very often when we have these courses, especially when I'm marketing them, I get this pushback from people, not pushback, but I get this feedback from people where they call them self-help courses. And I won't shy away that much from that title, from that category. I think that's fine to call it a self-help course. But what I do try to push back on is when people tell me, oh, relationships, my relationships are fine. This is not a course that's meant for people that are in crisis, if you will. This course is designed that people who possibly already know about the tool of empathy and utilize the tool of empathy in their lives should be able to enhance that, because we can all always get better. Even champions at relationships can always enhance and embellish their bonds with other people. And that becomes, by the way, the overarching goal of this course. I think it really gets summed up in the following text. Phil, can you read for us, please, on page 4, text 2, acquire a friend. You're muted, sorry.
Yoshua ben Parachia would say, appoint a teacher for yourself, acquire a friend for yourself, and judge all people favorably.
Rabbi Yoshua ben Parachia is a Talmudic sage, and he's being quoted here from a very famous part of the Talmud known as Ethics of Our Fathers. Ethics of Our Fathers is essentially one of the tractates. It's called Avot. And it's basically just a collection of ethical sayings, moral sayings, advice for life from throughout the Talmud that is collected into one tractate. And what does he say? So he says, of course, asay lecha rav, make for yourself a mentor. Great idea. Perfect. But then he says it's important for everyone to have friends. But look at the way he says that. That's what I want to talk about. He doesn't say, make sure you have friends. He says, acquire for yourself a friend. Acquire is and many of the commentary point this out on the spot there. They say acquire is a very proactive word. One of the things he's trying to tell us is that in order to have friends, in order to have relationships, you need to be proactive about them. And that is it's going to be our first and most important marching orders, if you will, for the entire course. Our overarching goal for the course is relationships don't happen to us. We must make them happen. We have to be proactive in how our relationships are occurring. This teaching, by the way, is highly significant because there's a lot of studies that show this. If you take a look in your textbook on page 6, you'll see that we're quoting from a paper from Nancy Newell, in which she points out that people who believe that success depends on their effort actually are, and this shouldn't come as any surprise, are much more likely to put in more effort into their relationships, right? To be more active in their investment of time and energy. And as a result, they have an outcome of more connection. But here's the kicker. It's kind of the opposite of a vicious cycle. It's an enhancing cycle. It's a proactive cycle. Why? Because when they take action in terms of their relationships, and then the relationships become enhanced, they reinforce their belief that actually their actions cause their relationships to be better. And in this way, it goes back, in Hebrew we say, it goes back, this circle follows over and over and over again. The more impact they put, the more effort they put into their being proactive in their relationships and enhancing their relationships actually begin to improve, and as a result, they put in more effort. And I think that's why the text that we just read from the Talmud is so important. Why? Because it reminds us that we need to operate with the mindset that the ball is in our court. Relationships don't happen to us. We have to make them happen. Okay. Some of the Torah's insights that we're going to be that can be taken out of the Torah to enhance relationships are for specific types of relationships. For example, the sacred bond between a husband and wife is a relationship that's discussed at length in the Torah, both in the Torah itself, and then all the commentary and the oral Torah and everything else around it, the Talmud and the Medrash, etc. There's a lot of advice for marriage. That is not the goal of today's course. In fact, I am giving a separate course for those of you that are interested in marriage advice, and from the Torah. We are giving a course called The Art of Marriage, appropriately named, in March. There's other advice in the Torah, especially in the Talmud, I can think of lots of it, that is specifically tailored to the dynamics of the parent-child relationship. I actually gave a course on this already. I did it last year in March. It was called The Art of Parenting, right? Also appropriately named. And that course would be appropriate for advice on parenting specifically and the whole relationship between parents and their children. If you'd like to take that course, you're more than welcome to. It's already recorded. It's on my YouTube channel. You can check that out if you'd like to. But this course is going to be specifically focusing on insights illuminating all forms of adult-to-adult connection. And it doesn't make a difference what type of connection that is. You know, Judith Snow described 4 categories of human connection. You can see it in the diagram on page 7 or in front of you here on the screen. And she describes that there are 4 categories of human connection, which she calls circles of support. Why? Because they start from the closest connections that form an immediate circle immediately around us. Think of the intimacy circle, the circle of intimacy. This, of course, is the people you know well and spend much time interacting with, often at home. You trust these people with the most personal parts of your life. You can't imagine your life without them. Again, I'm reading on page 7. If you can't follow it, if you aren't following with me. And then she says that circle begins to widen. Right after the circle of intimacy goes the circle of what she calls the circle of friendship. The circle of friendship is the people who are close to you, but not intimately. So these are the people you would share with them your dreams, good news, and troubles, right? But they're not necessarily the people that you would trust with the most personal parts of your life. Okay. Growing even wider is the circle of participation. These are the people you interact with frequently. So think of your coworkers at work. They're not your friends necessarily, but they're your coworkers, right? Think of the people you interact with at religious services. So like I said, the people you sit next to at the Kiddush, or you sit next to in shul. They can also double as your friends, just like they can sometimes double as your spouse. You're allowed to sit at the Kiddush next to your spouse. That's fine. But somebody who is not necessarily your friend, not necessarily your spouse, not necessarily your child. So they're not in the first 2 circles of intimacy and then friendship, right? But they're in your circle of participation. They're in your neighborhood groups, right? Maybe they're your neighbors. People can have very friendly relationships with their neighbors, but they're not their friends. I'm not going to call them up to tell them that I got a job promotion. But perhaps if we're both watering our lawn at the same time, I'll be talking over the fence and I'll say, oh, by the way, I got a job promotion. What's new with you? I got a job promotion. Beautiful. This is the same. I think the same applies for clubs that we're part of, right? Different neighborhood clubs that we might be a part of. And finally, the widest circle of all is what Judith Snow calls the circle of exchange. These are the people that are paid to be in your life. I discussed some of them earlier. A doctor, a therapist, a hairdresser, the person behind the counter at your cleaners. You might have a little bit of a relationship with them, but usually it's very, very transactional. It's very touch and go. They might know about some of the details in your life, but it's really the widest circle of all. Throughout this course, we are going to be unveiling different teachings that apply to all 4 relationship circles. Meaning, we might uncover a tip. For example, today, later at the end of today's lesson, when we're talking about empathy, we might uncover some tips that might help you in terms of being more empathetic to your hairdresser if your hairdresser is sharing with you while she's doing your hair that she's getting divorced. How to be properly empathetic. That same tip might apply in being more empathetic to your wife when your wife loses her job. Obviously, they have to be applied in the right way, right? You're not going to be empathetic in the same way to your hairdresser as you are to your wife. You can be empathetic to both of them, but in the proper way as appropriate for that circle. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the tips we're going to be uncovering over the course of the entire course are going to be applicable to all 4, but the tailoring of it, I'm going to leave up to you to be appropriate in that circle. And in fact, I'm going to do a little pause now for 30 seconds because I think it would be useful to you, even though it shouldn't be limited to that, but I think it would be useful to you to identify 4 people, right? One person from each circle. Someone in your intimate circle, that can be your wife, that can be your parents, that can be your children. or anyone else that you're that close to. Someone in your friendship circle, that's someone that you talk to all the time, but is not necessarily as intimate as someone in your inner circle. Someone in your participation group, your neighbor, someone you sit next to at the Kiddush, someone, right? Someone from your social club. And then finally, someone from your exchange circle. Why? Because even though we're not going to keep doing this as an exercise, whenever you're ready to, I think it's going to be super helpful to you to be able to apply these lessons in each of these circles. And when you have a name, this is strictly for you. You can do this on page 7. Just write a name in each circle that you'll be able to go back and say, so how would I apply this to this person? Because you'll see that obviously the way you apply it is very different to each person. Okay. By the conclusion of this course, the goal is that you should have a trove of insights at your disposal, illuminating your path toward enhancing these connections on all levels. Okay? That will do it, I think, for today's course objective, which, as I mentioned, is the first 15 minutes of today's lesson. And now we are ready for the remaining 2 portions of today's lesson. In the remaining time that we have, which is about 65 minutes, what I'd like to do is split the time in half. For a little over 30 minutes, we are going to be discussing the Torah's general approach to relationship, what we're calling soul connection. And after that, we are going to dive into one particular tool that we are going to unpack today, which is the art of empathy. Okay? And I'd like to start our conversation about soul connection, about the Torah's general approach to relationships, with what is commonly known as the Golden Rule. Although I don't think that's a Jewish name for it. I actually think it might be a Christian name. I don't know. But it comes to us from a famous story in the Talmud. The Talmud tells us that there was a would-be convert, a non-Jew who wanted to convert to Judaism. This is a very famous story, but I'm going to say it first of all like that. It's all fresh in our minds, and for the benefit of those that might not know it. The Talmud tells us the story of a would-be convert who approached the sage Shammai. Now, if you're unaware, Hillel and Shammai were 2 famous Talmudic sages who constantly argued with each other. They had 2 very different approaches to Judaism, although they were in love with it. They very much loved each other and respected each other, but they often disagreed. So he comes first to Shammai and he says, I would like to convert. He says, teach me the entire Torah while standing on 1 foot. And Shammai, famously vexed by the person's flippant attitude, he chases the potential convert out of his study hall. In fact, it says he chased him out with a measuring stick that he had with him. Okay? Literally chasing him out. This individual, undeterred, approached Hillel with the same request. But Hillel's approach was very different. Ron, if you can read for us, please, text 3a. Hillel teaches him the entire Torah while standing on 1 foot, and this is how it goes.
Hillel told him, whatever you find hateful when done to you, do not do to your fellow. This is all of Torah in its entirety. The rest is commentary. Go study the rest.
Now, undoubtedly, this ethical mandate, right? Whatever you don't want done to you, do not do that to your fellow. It doubles as excellent relationship advice, right? Why? Because our connections with others would be first rate if we flawlessly live by this principle. Never doing, saying, or even thinking anything about someone else that we would want someone to do, think, or say to us, right? Okay. Nevertheless, I really want to unpack what it means that this is the entire Torah. What does it mean this is all of Torah? How is that possible? What do you mean? There are many mitzvot in the Torah that have nothing to do with my relationship with Ron Rohr. Right? When I eat matzah, Ron Rohr, for all intents and purposes, cannot exist, and I'm doing a mitzvah by eating matzah. Right? When I give tzedakah to someone else, and Ron Rohr doesn't know about it, right? This has nothing to do with how I treat someone else. Okay, tzedakah maybe could be fit into that bubble, right? So Rashi, who is the foremost biblical and Talmudic commentator, was bothered by this question. He says, how could Hillel say this is the entire Torah, right? And he provided 2 explanations for Hillel's statement. Phil, you want to read them for us, please? Text 3b. We're on page 10 for those that are following.
God is referred to in the scriptures as our fellow, as in the verse, do not forsake your fellow and your father's fellow. Hillel intended that we should not disregard God's wishes, for we hate it when our fellow ignores our wishes. An alternate interpretation Hillel referred quite literally to our fellow humans, indicating the need to avoid robbery, theft, and adultery, and to obey the numerous other interpersonal mitzvot.
So Rashi gives two explanations. How is this statement, don't do unto your fellow what you wouldn't want done unto yourself, how is that the foundation of the entire Torah? Rashi says, number one, you can take fellow a little bit more figuratively, and it's actually a reference to God. God is called fellow, so if you honor his wishes, then that's the entire Torah, right? The entire Torah is God's wishes. Those are the mitzvot that God wants us to do. But the second explanation he says is, no, actually, Hillel is quite literally talking about fellow humans, right? And actually, it's not just the mitzvah of loving a fellow. Every time you give tzedakah, every time you avoid robbery, these are all mitzvot, right? Do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. These are all mitzvot. And when you do them, those are interpersonal mitzvot, and that is the foundation of the entire Torah. Now, each of these explanations really each has a major flaw. Why? Let's take a look at them. You'll see. And by the way, very often, this is why Rashi does this. Why does he give two explanations? Why doesn't he just give one explanation? He's giving two explanations because each one complements the other with a flaw that it has. Let's go through them one at a time. The first explanation Rashi gave was that God is called fellow. So when he says, don't do unto others what you wouldn't want done unto yourself, right? He's talking about God. Don't do to God what God doesn't want you to do, right? So then the simple question is, why didn't Hillel say God? Why did he use the term fellow? Don't do unto your fellow what you wouldn't want done unto you. If he's talking about God, just say, don't do unto God what you wouldn't want God to do to you. Right? Okay, so Rashi brings a second explanation. The second explanation is, no, take it more literally. It's actually talking about your friends. But if that's the case, then that doesn't include all the mitzvot. As I said, the convert asked about the entire Torah, and matzah has nothing to do with interpersonal relationships. Right? Keeping Shabbat has nothing to do with interpersonal relationships. Making kiddush on Friday night, nothing to do with interpersonal relationships. Putting on tefillin every day, lighting Shabbat candles, these are all mitzvah that have nothing to do with interpersonal relationships, right? So what I'd like to do today is try and see, can we come up with a more singular answer that can satisfactorily explain Hillel's statement of the foundation of the entire Torah being about relationships, the foundation of the entire Torah being, don't do unto others what you wouldn't want done unto yourself. And to discover a deeper soul-based answer to this question, we are going to turn to King Solomon. Ecclesiastes is Kohelet, a book in which King Solomon writes a lot of his wisdom, and he has this interesting statement. Text 4. Elise, do you have the PDF with you? You have the text?
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead. Text 4.
I was trying to catch up. I was reading through them, but I'll do that later.
All right.
Okay.
We're on page 12, text 4, two
All right.
conflicting spirits.
Okay. Whoa. Behind here. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Two conflicting spirits. How many understand that the spirit of the human ascends on high, while the spirit of the beast descends to the earth?
This is one of the most insightful statements that King Solomon makes, that every single human being has two spirits within him. There is the spirit of the human that ascends on high, or the spirit of the beast that descends to the earth. King Solomon is telling us it is so easy to be coaxed into thinking that human beings are merely complex primates. We are essentially animals. And he asks the question, he asks it in a question form, right? How many understand that even though there are many similarities between human beings and animals, that is not the sum total between a human being of a human being's existence, and that the human being has another side to him. Although he has a side of him which descends to the earth, which all it wants is its earthly wants and needs, conversely, human beings also have a spirit that reaches for the heavens, trying to find meaning and depth beyond themselves, to transcend themselves, to see outwards and upwards. Jewish mysticism consistently reveals more profound understandings of the Torah's teachings, and especially a statement like this is unpacked by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement. In his magnum opus known as the Tanya, I know many of you have explored it in the past. Some of you are even attending the Thursday night class, which is a Tanya class. And he says that these two spirits are actually two souls. In reality, it's two distinct souls. You know, we talk about our neshama, we talk about how every single Jew has a soul. The Alter Rebbe makes a little addendum, a little asterisk. Actually, you have two souls. Let's see how he describes this. These two souls that are in an epic battle for control and supremacy. We are on on page 13 with text 5. Ron, if I can ask you to read for us, please. The inner battle.
Imagine two kings locked in battle, each desperate to gain control over the same city, rule its inhabitants according to his will, and ensure that they obey his every decree. That same battle rages within each of us, between our two souls. Our godly soul and its rival, the animalistic soul, wage war over our bodies and all its limbs.
If you feel torn between two souls, it turns out, I'm sorry, between two selves. In other words, there's the me that I like, that I want to be, and that I often even am. And then sometimes there's the me I'm not so proud of being. I can't tell you how often this happens to me at shul, where somebody tells to me, somebody comes to the shul and I welcome them and I say, yeah, whatever, Ron, it's so nice to see you. And Ron says to me, yeah, it's nice that I came to shul today, but if you would know what else is going on in my life, I'm not so proud of where I am right now in my life. Right? In other words, we're constantly torn back and forth. We have the good deeds that we do, and then we know that we should be doing more good deeds. We should be better about ourselves. And the question becomes, which one is the real us? Right? The Alter Rebbe's suggestion is that actually we have two souls. Based on King Solomon's words, he says, there's the spirit of the human and the spirit of the beast. The godly soul and the animal soul. The soul that tries to strive higher, and the soul that strives only for more base and immoral, and well, not necessarily immoral, but more selfish desires. Now, which of these two souls has a greater hold on our everyday lives? Right? So that's the real big question. So the Alter Rebbe explains that for most of us, the animal soul is the more dominant one. And in order to make the divine soul more dominant, or even to allow the divine soul within us to shine even a little bit, we have to put in some hard work. And this is hinted to, by the way, in a line that we say every morning in our prayers. Text 6. Text 6 is a line from every single morning's prayers. We say, Elokai, my God, neshama shenatata bi taharehi. The soul that you placed within me is pure. Right? Obviously, this is a reference to the divine soul. This is not talking about the animal soul. This is right. This is not talking about the animal soul that has the base desires. That's not the pure soul. The pure soul is the godly soul. But look at the way it's described. We're on page 13. The soul that you placed within me, almost as if this soul is distinct from me, and then you put it in me. Why? This is because although the animal soul doesn't necessarily always have the last word, and we work all of our lives that it shouldn't, the animal soul always has the first word. The animal soul is also often called the primal soul, or the life-giving soul. Why? Because that's the selfish soul. Now, selfish usually is a dirty word in the English language, but actually, if you think about it, being selfish is very important. It's a very important part of our lives. Why? Because if we wouldn't be selfish, we wouldn't live. Selfish is to eat. Selfish is to sleep. Selfish is to breathe. Right? You're doing something for yourself. So that's it's a vital part of who we are. It's often called the vital soul, right? But now after that happens, Hashem takes a pure soul. He takes the godly soul and he puts that into us, and he says, okay, now let's see if you can actually tap into that and see what that's all about. And that's why we have this conflict. Every single day we wake up, as my father-in-law would put it, it's good morning Vietnam. The godly soul is here, and all it wants is for us to have the spirit to quote text 4 that we just read, the spirit of the human being that ascends on high. It wants to connect to God. It wants to transcend ourselves. It wants to be more than just selfish. But comes back the animal soul with the spirit of the beast, and says, no, let's be more primal. Let's be more selfish. Let me be more about me, right? Which is why very often the way people talk about these two souls is the selfish soul and the selfless soul. There's one soul that just wants to be more about me, and the other one wants to be more about someone else. All right. Now that we've had that little introduction, appreciating that within every single one of us there are two souls, I want to talk about what happens when two of those souls meet. Now, there's two of those sets of souls meet. All right? So let's say, for example, myself and Phil Reutman, we bump into each other on the street, and we're talking to each other. And let's say we're going to attempt to do something together. So you would think that you have here Phil Reutman, who has a godly soul and an animal soul. That's two. Zushi Rifkin, who has two souls, a godly soul and an animal soul. And now they're going to battle it out, 2 versus 2, right? That's actually not how it works at all. Phil, you want to read for us, please? Text 7, soul arithmetic. You'll see some of the strangest math you've ever seen in your life.
When two people discuss spiritual growth and study Torah together, there are 2 godly souls against 1 natural soul.
So hold on a second. You have 2 souls versus 2 souls. 1 human being with a divine soul and, and an animal soul. Another human being with a divine soul and an animal soul. But somehow 2 plus 2 equals 3 here. It's 2 divine souls. It's 2 godly souls versus 1 animal soul. How does that work? This reveals the crucial difference that there is between the 2 souls, particularly when it comes to relationships with other people. Remember how I told you the godly soul is selfless and the animal soul is selfish? Yes. This is where it all comes in. The selfish soul, all it wants is for you to pursue your own needs. So let's say you bump into somebody else. That person also is trying to pursue their own needs. Why would we team up against each other? Why would we team up with each other? Survival of the fittest. Phil wants to survive. I want to survive. I want to be selfish. He wants to be selfish. I want to eat. He wants to eat. So if we're both standing in line for the Kiddush, we're going to be pushing each other out of the way to get to the buffet, right? That's how animal souls work. Even though each of them wants the same thing, the selfishness for themselves, they can never team up with each other because they are selfish in their very nature. But let's try with the godly souls. What does Phil's godly soul want? To transcend his animal soul and connect to God. What does my animal soul want? What does my godly soul want? To transcend my animal soul and connect to God, right? To transcend myself and be about something more than me. So if so, then the 2 of them do team up. In other words, 2 godly souls team up with each other in order to overcome animal souls. But 2 animal souls don't have the capability to overcome, to team up with another soul. Why? Because that goes against its very nature of being selfish and being all out for itself. So when 2 Jews come together, and let's say they want to study Torah together, it all of a sudden becomes much easier. You may have heard of the Jewish concept of a chavruta. Chavruta means where 2 people come together to study Torah together. Why do we team up to do so? Because when we team up to do something good together, then both of our godly souls work together against each one of our animal souls independently. It's now my godly soul and Phil's godly soul versus my animal soul. And my godly soul and Phil's godly soul versus Phil's animal soul. Tackling each one independently. This doesn't mean that the animal soul isn't capable of love. It is capable of love. But the only type of love it would be capable of is what I would call selfish love. Right? We've all encountered people like this. They only love me because they want something out of me. They're here to get something out of me. That's the type of love that an animal soul can have. And this is best described by text 8, which is a Jewish folktale in which Rabbi Adin Even Yisrael Steinsaltz uses a fish in order to describe a concept known as fish love. Right? Sell fish love. But instead of reading it, we're going to watch it. We have a beautiful animation here. And if I can ask you to turn your attention to the video screens for this story, this Jewish folktale about fish love. Oops.
There is a Jewish folktale that illustrates how vague the meaning of the word love can be, and also demonstrates some of the basic problems in statements such as, "I love you." Once upon a time, a fisherman caught a large pike, and when he pulled the fish out of the water and saw its size, he said, "This is wonderful. I'll take it to the Baron. He loves pike." The poor fish says to himself, "There's some hope for me yet." The fisherman brings the fish to the manor house, and the guard says, "What do you have?" "A pike." "Great," says the guard. "The Baron loves pike." The fish feels that there is some corroboration of the facts. The fisherman enters the palace, and though the fish can hardly breathe, he still has hope. The Baron loves pike. He is brought into the kitchen, and all the cooks exclaim how much the Baron loves pike. The fish is placed on a table, and the Baron himself enters and gives instructions. Cut off the tail, cut off the head, and slit it this way. With his last breath, the fish cries out in great despair. Why did you lie? You don't love pike, you love yourself.
The animal soul cannot engage in anything more than this type of love, selfish love. Why? Because it's all about me. That's it. It's not about helping someone else. It's only about helping me. Now that might sometimes look like helping someone else, right? But it ultimately can only, it's only available to fuel these interactions if it perceives self-gain, right? So if I see something in it for me in this relationship, then I will do it. If not, not. This analysis, by the way, forces us to reconsider a pop culture truism, if you will, where people say, be yourself in a relationship. You cannot come into the relationship and be fake. You have to be yourself. Be yourself in the relationship. Be yourself, be yourself, be yourself. Most people assume that that's very, very healthy in a relationship. Why? Because if you're putting on a show, you won't be able to keep it up. Eventually, it's going to fall apart. You have to be yourself. You have to be your true and authentic self in the relationship. But I would argue that being yourself is important, but it's insufficient. And in fact, if you only be yourself, then you're being your true animal self, and then the relationship will ultimately fall apart. What do I mean by that? If you just be yourself, and by be yourself here I mean be your default self, right? What we said is the first thought that comes to mind, the selfish part of us, then ultimately you're going to end up with three big problems from this relationship. By being so true to yourself, you will also begin to repel people away from you. People will run away from you. Why? Because they begin to sense that you're all about your own agenda. You're so much being yourself that it becomes so clear that you're only in this for you, right? So it repels friends rather than attracting them. Problem number two is, even if people agree to say, all right, you know what, I get it, this is how relationships work, everybody's in it for themselves. So they decide to try to have a relationship with you, and they won't be repelled from you, right? Even so, the relationship will not be genuine. Any connection that there's going to be, if both parties are aware that we're only in this, for each person's in it for themselves, for whatever my own self-interest is, what we would call, let's say, one hand washing the other, there might be some level of connection, but the connection that there's going to be is automatically going to be extremely shallow, right? So number one is that it's going to be very difficult to have any relationships. Number two is, even if there is a relationship, it's not going to be very genuine. It's going to be very shallow. And number three, an individual that's only driven by his animal soul, in other words, he's only being his default self, right? Eventually, in their interactions with other people, they're bound to trample other people's desires. Because at its core, all they're here for is themselves. Especially if it can somehow rationalize trampling over someone else's desire in order to some of the greater good of getting what I want out of this relationship, right? And that starts to sow seeds in the relationship that ultimately blossom into a very, very bitter fruit known as alienation. It starts to alienate other people from you. When we say it's not good for the human being, when Hashem says, when God says, Lo tov hayot adam levado, it's not good for a human being to be alone, he means truly alone. And anybody who is only in tune with their animal soul, only in tune with their selfish side, is ultimately condemned to being alone. So if I were to approach that truism of in order to be in a relationship, you have to be your true self, I would amend it a little bit. I would say, don't just be yourself, be your best self. In other words, be your true self. Because remember, there's two souls. There's a godly soul and an animal soul. Don't just be yourself by tuning into your animal soul. Be your true self, your best self, which is being in tune with your godly soul. What happens then then in this relationship, you're not just out in it for yourself, you're actually out in it for the other. You're actually transcending yourself, trying to be more than yourself by being selfless. And in this way, all three of these problems get reversed onto their head. Why? Because all the people around us, instead of feeling like they're just part of my agenda, they feel cherished. Instead of feeling like they're having a very shallow relationship with me, why? Because the relationship is only built on what I can get from them, what they can get from me. Instead, it becomes a genuine connection that they actually feel that I care about them. And finally, obviously, there are not going to be these seeds of pain which grow into fruit of alienation. Why? Because they actually feel the relationship is authentic and not just superficial in order for me to get what I need out of the relationship. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about something, because right about now, I'm sure many of you are thinking about some of the relationships that you have. And it could be even some of the relationships in your intimate circles. And you think to yourself, hold on a second. If I'm really honest with myself, this relationship started on some sort of selfish need. And I'm not talking about, oh, I got married to this person because they were rich, and therefore I wanted their money. Nah, most of us are more sophisticated than that. But if we're honest to ourselves, we say, you know what? I got married to this person because of the way they made me feel. Hold on a second. That seems selfish to me, right? That seems animal soul driven, if you will, right? And this is when I want to say that it really doesn't matter what brought us into any given relationship. It's very common for most relationships to begin with some sort of self-interest in mind. And that's okay. You know, in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes, another famous wise quote from King Solomon is, were it not for the evil inclination, man would not build a home, marry, and sire children. Because obviously every human being has a sexual drive, and that drives them to find a mate. And again, that's a very primal and animalistic way of looking at it. But Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, King Solomon doesn't seem to be saying that's a terrible thing. That's how it starts. But there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is if it stays at that. If we are stuck in that mindset, and I'm still only married to my spouse because of how they make me feel, or even worse, in order to get money out of them, or in order to have sexual relations with them, right? Never mind, you talk about all sorts of other relationships, right? If it's still transactional, if it's still conditional on something, that's when there's an issue. And this is where the second text that we read today, which is going to become a fundamental text for the entire course, acquire for yourself a friend, be proactive in your relationships. This is where this lesson comes in. Why? Because being proactive doesn't just mean being proactive in the way we seek out relationships. It means being proactive in the way in where our relationship is holding currently. Right? Where are you at currently in your relationship? Are you still stuck in the way the relationship started, or have you actually taken it up a notch and made it a little bit more selfless? I want to add in a point here, which is really going to drive this home. You know, back to Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Fathers, right? That Talmudic tractate, which has all of these advice for life, if you will. There's another beautiful statement that it says there. It says, one should not engage in what's known as Ava Hatluya Bedavar, but rather you should have Ava She'ina Tluya Bedavar. Okay? Ava Tluya Bedavar means a person should engage in love that is unconditional. It's not dependent on a thing. That's the type of love you should have. Right? And then it continues, and you shouldn't have a love that is dependent on something. Right? Conditional love versus unconditional love. However, I want to talk about something. In Hebrew, the term is Ahava Hatluya Bedavar. You should never engage in love that is dependent on something else. But notice that the Mishnah does not belittle Ahava Haba'a Midavar. Love that was prompted by something, was prompted by a cause. And the Rebbe, you can see this, by the way, in Appendix D, if you'd like. That's where I'm kind of taking this idea from, in Appendix D. I'm not really going to quote all the quotes, etc. But the Rebbe really talks about this. He says it's such a beautiful point. Notice the example that the Talmud gives us, that the Mishnah gives us then. What is a love that is not dependent on anything? It brings the example of the friendship of King David and Yehonatan, or Jonathan, who was the son of King Saul. Right? Now, if you start to go into the details of that relationship, It's true that it ended up as an unconditional relationship, but it started off very much as a dependent love. It then morphed into a selfless, essential love. But it started off as a dependent love, something that's dependent on, without getting into it, but there was a transactional element to the relationship. And I think that this message is very empowering to us. That not just because some of the relationships that we're in are currently transactional or maybe started off as transactional, does that mean that that's where it needs to end? We can take any relationship we have with anyone, whether it's a friend, a coworker, someone you sit next to at the Kiddush, or your spouse, and again, each one in their appropriate way, and we can turn it from being a transactional relationship into being an essential relationship, being unconditional and totally not dependent on anything that we're out to get out of this relationship. And now, I'd like to go back to the statement of Hillel. Remember, Hillel said to the would-be convert, "Ma da'alach sani lechavrach lo savid." Whatever you hate, don't do to your friend. Let's view that statement as we discussed it through the soul paradigm. In other words, animal soul or godly soul. The animal soul, which is solely focused on itself, will eventually lead a person to do unto others what is hateful to itself. It never starts with doing something terrible to someone else. It always starts with an attitude of I'm in this for me. So Hillel is saying, essentially in one line, he's saying, try and live a life that is godly soul-oriented, that is divine soul-oriented, that is transcendent to yourself. Don't be so hung up in yourself. In a word, Hillel is saying, don't be selfish. Not being selfish, the entire Torah can really be hung on not being selfish. If you're not just in life to get whatever you want out of it, then you will do what God wants. You will do the mitzvah that God wants. And obviously, in all of our relationships, they will be enhanced tremendously, right? In all of our interpersonal relationships, we will take it. We will do the mitzvot. Let's say something like not stealing or not committing adultery, because we are not focused on ourselves. We are focused on others. Let's see how the Alter Rebbe, remember that's how this whole thing started. Let's see how he puts it in Tanya in chapter 32. Ron, can you read for us, please? We are on page 16, text 9, the soul of the Torah.
This is what Hillel and Hillel the elder meant when he stated regarding the mitzvah to love your fellow. This is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary, etc. For the foundation and root of the entire Torah is to prioritize and raise the divine soul over the body.
That's a big deal. That last statement becomes a very, very big deal. Why? Because it turns out that every single mitzvah in the Torah is ultimately trying to do that last line. To raise, to prioritize and raise the divine soul over the body. To make your life a godly soul life and not an animal soul life. To be a little bit more selfless and a little bit less selfish. And every single mitzvah ultimately comes from that. Every single mitzvah ultimately boils down to that. And all of this reveals to us a profound idea about the Jewish attitude to relationships. At times, we tend to reduce our relationships, placing them alongside all the other mundane needs that we have in life. We need a place to live, we need food to eat, we need hobbies to keep us busy, and we need a relationship. Why? Because it's a primal need that human beings have to have a relationship. But if that's the way we have a relationship, then ultimately it will fizzle. Either it'll end, if you're talking about a spousal relationship, it'll end in divorce, or it will definitely lead to many moments of friction throughout our lives. Why? Because the foundation of the relationship is shaky, is unhealthy. But in fact, it turns out that every single relationship really is a divine experience. It's a spiritual experience. It's all about being in tune with the piece of God in you and not with the animal primal part of yourself. Right? Between these two souls, we have to constantly be striving to be more godly soul oriented. And I want to point something out, by the way. It's a really big fundamental shift, if you will, in the way we look at relationships. I don't know that any of you here would say that the way you thought of relationships before you came onto this Zoom was as a spiritual journey. Sure, my relationship with God is a spiritual journey, but my relationship with my spouse is a spiritual journey? It turns out it is. Why? Because every single part of any relationship, whether your spouse or anyone else, ultimately is a journey to be more soul-focused and less body-focused, to be more godly soul-focused and less animal soul-focused. And this has a very interesting side point. You know, the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, would often write letters to people would ask the Rebbe for life advice. And often that life advice, as tends to be, would be relationship advice. Rebbe, I have an issue in my spousal relationship. I have an issue in my relationship with my children, etc. And sometimes the Rebbe's advice seemed so divorced from the request that people were making. People would say, my marriage is falling apart. And the Rebbe would say, start to put on tefillin every day, and then you'll see more blessing in your marriage. What are we, bribing God? What's going on here? God, here I'm putting on tefillin every day, now you owe it to me, make my relationship better. It turns out that based on the insight that we just had, we understand exactly what's going on here. The Rebbe understood that any relationship that is faltering can be boiled down to the same point. There is an issue that one or both parties are too animal soul focused. They're too self-focused. And any mitzvah that you do, whether it's putting on tefillin, giving tzedakah, or not murdering, ultimately is an exercise in being more selfless and less selfish. And it turns out that any mitzvah you do can enhance your relationship. So if you're looking to enhance a relationship, any relationship that it might be, a good idea would be maybe take a resolution. For the next month, in order to enhance this relationship, I'm going to put on tefillin every day. I'm going to put up a mezuzah on my door in order to enhance my relationship. Because the connection is much more direct than you would think. It's not about bribing God. It's not about doing a mitzvah for God so that He can do something for you. It's about being more other-focused, whether that's other as in God or other as in other human beings. Okay. And that, my friends, is the conclusion of the second part of today's lesson, which is the general approach that Judaism takes to relationships. And you're going to see me over and over again over the next 6 weeks, whatever, 5.5 weeks, 5.5 lessons. Over and over again, we're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to this fundamental idea that a relationship from a Jewish perspective is a spiritual experience. It's about being more other-focused. It's about being more in tune with your nefesh elokit, with your godly soul. Okay. So now, I'd like to use the remaining time in today's lesson, we have about 30 minutes left, 35 minutes, to really unpack one tool that will enhance our relationships. And that is, of course, the art of empathy. Because with more soul consciousness, by being more in tune with our soul, we're just generally enhanced. We've just generally enhanced our relationships. But if we really want to practically take steps forward, we have to have actionable advice, actionable tools in our chest that we are going to use to enhance that relationship. And over the next 6 weeks, we're going to do 6 of them. And today we are going to start with empathy. Okay. Our discussion of empathy is going to be coming directly from the Torah, but we are going to divide it into the modern language of Professor Brené Brown, who's a leader in this industry. Brené Brown, who's still with us, she's born in 1965, but still around. She is a social worker and an author, and has quite a few books on the topics of, things like empathy and shame and vulnerability and leadership, etc. All of the general topic of relationships. And when she talks about empathy, she really divides it into 2 types of empathy. The first type of empathy is cognitive empathy, empathy that has to do with the brain. And the second type of empathy is what she calls affective empathy, or maybe in better words, is emotional empathy. So we're not going to be quoting her that much, we'll quote her a little bit, but we're going to divide our conversation into 2 types of empathy, the way she divides it, cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. We're going to see them both in the Torah and how the Torah encourages us to have this type of empathy. The first type of empathy, cognitive empathy, in order to understand this type of empathy from the Torah, we are going to go to the story of Joseph. Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the righteous, of course, is one of the 12 sons of Yaakov Avinu, of Jacob, our forefather. And his story starts in the Torah in Parshat Vayeshev. The Torah tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his other brothers. And Joseph was a dreamer. He had 2 dreams predicting his future leadership over his brothers. And when he told these dreams to his brothers, they became more and more jealous of him, and the relationship soured. And eventually, they kidnapped him and sold him into slavery. Joseph is sold to a man whose name was Potiphar. Potiphar was one of Pharaoh's ministers in Egypt. So he's now very far from his family that's living in the land of Israel, and he's living in Egypt. Today they seem very close, but back then, for sure, it was a very, very long distance. At first, Joseph works in Potiphar's home, this minister of Pharaoh, but then Potiphar's wife accuses him falsely of trying to rape her, and Potiphar throws Joseph into prison. In quick succession, things have gone from bad to worse for Joseph, and eventually it ends up as nightmarish. Okay. One day, Joseph is in prison, and two of Pharaoh's servants, his cupbearer, in other words, his bartender, the winemaker, and his baker, they had both offended the king in various ways, and they were incarcerated together with Joseph. And one day, you know what, the rest of the story we'll pick up from text 10a. Elise, can you read it for us, please? We're on page 17, Joseph and the chamberlains.
Okay, each of them, the cupbearer and the baker, for the king of Egypt, who were imprisoned in the dungeon, dreamed a dream. Each one had his dream on the same night, and each dream had its own meaning. Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them. They looked disturbed. He questioned Pharaoh's chamberlains, who were with him. Oh, I'm sorry. He questioned Pharaoh's chamberlains who were with him in the prison of his master's house, asking, "Why are your faces poorly today?" They told him, "We dreamed a dream and there is no interpreter for it." Joseph responded to them, "Do interpretations not belong to God? Tell them now to me."
In other words, he's suggesting that he might be able, he says, listen, the real interpretation only God knows, but if you tell me, then maybe I'll be able to help you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay,
Joseph. Oh, I'm sorry. No. Hold on. Before we get to his... Okay. Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't realize the text was done. There's going to be text 10b in a second, but I want to just talk for a second. So each of them tells over the dream to Joseph. Joseph interprets the dreams. First, he listens to the cupbearer. The cupbearer's dream was that he dreamt about 3 vines and grapes and things, whatever, without getting into the details. And Joseph interprets it to mean that the cupbearer would be pardoned in 3 days' time. Okay. Then he listens carefully to the baker's dream, a whole story about 3 baskets of bread on his head. And Joseph interprets it to mean that in 3 days' time, the baker is going to be executed. And 3 days later, indeed, Joseph's predictions proved to be true. Now let's analyze this narrative. Individuals that were confined in Pharaoh's dungeon would be expected to be profoundly miserable. Would you agree? I mean, you're literally incarcerated. All of your freedoms have been taken away from you. And very often that's for no fault of your own, especially in those days, right? The king was in a bad mood one day, you did something slightly wrong, boom, that was the end of you. So when Joseph observed their distressed faces, he could have easily just said, these people are down because they're in prison, right? And Joseph could have said to himself, they look miserable. He could have said to himself, I have no need to start digging in their business. They're miserable because they're in prison. Today they didn't get enough food. Yesterday they also didn't get enough food, but they were able to bear it. And today they can't bear it. And that's fine. Yet he didn't respond that way because he noticed something very specifically different. Let's go back to text 10a. Do you notice? Excuse me. It's actually not in 10a. I'm trying to see where it is. Hold on. Yeah, it is. Madua penechem ra'im hayom. Joseph says to them, why are your faces poorly today? What does today mean? So the Abarbanel, is one of the commentary on this verse. And Phil, if you can read for us, please, what he says in text 10b, Joseph's daily empathy.
Joseph specified today. Joseph understood and expected that individuals suffering incarceration would be in a foul mood and look glum. However, he asked because he noticed a distinction between that specific day and every prior day of their incarceration.
Says the Abarbanel, Joseph was perceptive about the people around him. In other words, he was a master of empathy, as we'll soon see. He didn't only do this on this particular morning that he noticed that they were melancholy, that he noticed that they were down. He did so every day. But only this day, right? Only this day did he notice that they were down. But here's the key. in order for him to know that they were more down today than other days, because they were disturbed because of their dreams, he needed to have been observing them every day. It turns out every single day he was in tune with the people around him. He knew that they were down every single day and that it wasn't a big deal because that was just being down from being in prison. But he was able to recognize on their face that today they were more down than other days. And this was only possible because he observed them every single day. Having noticed their foul moods, he took the next step and now inquired whether he could help. If you pay attention in the rest, we're not really quoting all the verses in the Torah that go through this story, but there's actually a lot of details there that start to point this out to you. The pasuk says, the verse says, he asked Pharaoh's chamberlains who were with him in the prison of his master's house. Right? I don't understand. We already knew they were with him in the prison of his master's house. That's very redundant. The Torah doesn't usually use redundant words, right? The Torah is emphasizing that Joseph was with them. Right? The Torah is highlighting Joseph's empathetic attitude. Right? In other words, the fact that he is with them every single day and he observes how they're feeling. In modern psychological language, Joseph is exhibiting a healthy dose of empathy, but more specifically, cognitive empathy. Ron, can you read for us, please, about the difference? This is Brene Brown right here, text 11 on page 19.
Empathy, the most powerful tool of compassion, is an emotional skill set that allows us to understand what someone is experiencing and to reflect back that understanding. Most researchers agree that there are at least two elements to empathy: cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy, sometimes perspective perspective talking or mentalizing, is the ability to recognize and understand another person's emotions. Affective empathy, often called experience sharing, is one's own emotional attunement with another person's experience.
Thank you, Ron. I know that was a lot of psychological language. So let me just unpack it for you. Cognitive empathy is essentially perspective taking. Being able to actually be aware of the other person's perspective. You don't have to feel anything that's going on by them. That's effective empathy. You just need to be able to actually understand things from their perspective, perceive how they are thinking and feeling. And this is crucial for connection. In our story, we observe Yosef exhibiting cognitive empathy. Only somebody who is cognitively empathetic can actually be in tune every single day with the way a person, hold on, yeah, they're depressed, but today they're more depressed than yesterday. Why? Because I'm constantly putting myself in the other person's shoes and understanding, even if not feeling, understanding their perspective. Now, I want to point out a few details about Joseph's cognitive empathy here. Number one is, it stands in stark contrast to his earlier life. Let's think about Joseph as a young boy telling over his dreams of ruling over his brothers to his brothers. You could easily argue, and there are some commentary that do, some have other explanations for it, but some commentary argue that that's Joseph being the exact opposite, completely non-empathetic. He's not appreciating the perspective that perhaps his brothers might not take his dreams in a good way, and they might actually, excuse me, and they might actually be offended and become jealous by it, right? So take a look what's going on here. Joseph has gone through a tremendous journey of growth. If you ever kick yourself in the pants that you're not empathetic enough, think about Joseph, who's gone through all this growth, and now he's completely empathetic. And I want to point out another amazing thing. It's worth taking note that Joseph is also going through his own hell while he's being empathetic of other people. Most of us, one of the biggest challenges, and we'll talk more about this later, to being empathetic to other people is we're so busy worried about our own garbage, about our own baggage. I'm having a rough day today. Today I can't be empathetic. This happens to people in spousal relationships. This happens to parents that lose their patience with their children because they had a rough day at work, right? Here's Joseph, who not only, here's what he finds. There's so much anger and trauma going on in his life that he would have been forgiven for not being empathetic to someone else. Not only did he suffer the untimely death of his mother, Rachel, at a young age, right? He was abducted by his brothers, right? Complete trust betrayal. Betrayal of trust, right? And they left him stranded in a pit, teeming with snakes and scorpions. Then he's enslaved in a foreign land. And now he's falsely accused of raping his master's wife. Oh my goodness. All these tribulations, he would have been forgiven for not being empathetic. And yet his empathy shines through. Take a look at how the Rebbe points this out. Phil, if you can read for us, please, text 12. We're on page 20. Empathy at all costs.
Joseph had been made to suffer the greatest injustices. He was sold as a slave in Egypt and then jailed without guilt. One might have expected him to be embittered, angry at the world. Nevertheless, when he noticed that Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and baker looked unusually distraught, he approached them and inquired, "Why are your faces poorly today?" Joseph descended from Abraham, regarding whom God proclaimed that he would command his children and his household after him to keep God's ways by doing righteousness and justice. Consequently, upon seeing one of God's creatures in a mood quite the contrary of joyful, after all, the mere recognition that a person is a creation of the Holy One should be sufficient cause for joy. Joseph took the fact that the matter had caught his attention as evidence that the matter was relevant to him. Therefore, he immediately sought to be of assistance.
And this is an amazing, amazing detail as you start to notice Joseph's story. Now, our sages taught us that we should learn from Joseph's empathy. A great example is expressed in text 13. Elise, you want to read it for us, please? This comes from the Medrash on a verse from Psalms. In Tehillim, Psalms, it says, "Praise be one who understands those who are in need." And Elise, if you can read for us the explanation in text 13 that the Medrash gives. What does it mean, someone who understands those who are in need?
What does understand mean in this context? It refers to one who carefully considers and reflects on the strategy to sustain the person in need. For example, when a wealthy person faces a drastic downturn, the understanding benefactor visits the formerly wealthy person and asks, "I heard that an inheritance will be coming your way in such and such a location, and that so-and-so owes you money. If you wish, accept this sum from me, and when the inheritance comes to you, or when that debtor pays the debt, you can pay me back." The person understands those who are in need.
This person understands those who are in need. Cognitive empathy. There are many verses in the Torah, thank you, Elise, that praise a person who acts charitably. Oh, this person gives tzedakah, amazing. He gave $1 million to tzedakah, amazing. But this verse is praising something else. This verse is praising someone who displays cognitive empathy. That he doesn't just give $1 million, he gives $1 million as the result of understanding that the $1 million was needed by this particular person. And sometimes that understanding comes with lots of other nuances. Maybe this person is not ready to accept the money. Maybe, right, whatever it is. Maybe he's only giving $1, but he's giving it with cognitive empathy. He understands the perspective that the other person comes from. He understands their internal struggles, and therefore he responds in kind. And that leads to empathetic action. The empathy isn't just a crucial ingredient in tzedakah. It's not just a crucial ingredient in charitable giving. It's also a crucial ingredient in any relationship. To truly excel as a friend, to truly excel as a spouse, to truly excel as a parent, you need to be able to understand the perspective of the other person. We need to be able to discern their inner turmoil and then perceive what type of help exactly it is that they need and then give it to them. And this is what it means that when it says maskil eladol, that someone, what was the English translation? Understands those who are in need. So far, we've had a massive takeaway from the Torah about being cognitively empathetic. And I would say that there's really two elements to it. Number one is just to be able to be cognitively empathetic, to be able to actually understand the perspective that another person comes from, to follow Joseph's example and actually understand another person's perspective. Number two is to do so despite whatever baggage we have that's going on. That we might be in a situation, and that this takes practice, by the way. This takes practice. Soon we'll do an exercise that practices it. But to be able to do so despite whatever we might have going on in our lives that might be stopping us even from being empathetic to ourselves, to be able to be empathetic to other people despite that. Okay. Now let's take it deeper, and let's move on to emotional empathy, or what's known as affective empathy. There is a verse in the Torah, in Mishlei, in Proverbs, also from King Solomon, that I think we quoted it in the last course, the happiness course, for those of you that were there. It goes like this. It says, Daiga b'lev ish yasichena. If a person has worry in his heart, yasichena. What does yasichena mean? So yasichena can be read two different ways. Either yashchena or yasichena. And these are two different ways of dealing with worry in a person's heart, anxiety the person is suffering. Elise, can you read it first, please? I'm sorry, you just read. Ron, if you can read for us, please. Text 14a on page 23. Two different methods for anxiety.
Rabbis Ami and Asi each suggested a method for handling anxiety. One said, cast it from the mind. The other said, speak it over with others.
Okay. Two very famous ways of dealing with anxiety. Either distract yourself from it, don't think about the thing that's making you anxious, it's not doing you any good, or speak it over with someone else. Now notice, he says speak it over with others. He doesn't clarify who those others are. In text 14b, Ron, if you can keep reading, please. Others is qualified.
They are others only in the bodily sense. However, they are wholly united with you, for they feel your reality.
He says, look for somebody that's other only in body, but not in spirit. Other in animal soul, but not in godly soul. Someone who actually can be in it with you. This is what we call affective or emotional empathy. This is not just appreciating the other person's perspective, but feeling to some degree at least the other person's pain. Feeling the emotion that they're feeling their joy, feeling their pain, feeling what they have. Indeed, there's no point in telling other people about your anxiety if they're not going to feel your reality, right? If they're just going to look at you and say, well, I'm so sorry you feel that way. What's the point in talking it over with them? The whole purpose of talking it over with them is so that they will be there together with you. Renee Brown has a beautiful TED Talk that she did, which was actually set to animation, which we're going to watch now, in which she talks about the difference between sympathy and empathy. And this really drives home what it means, emotional or affective empathy, the idea of being there together with someone actually feeling the emotion that they are feeling. Please turn your attention to the video screens.
Brene Brown is an American professor and social worker, a best-selling author, and a podcast host. In a relatable and engaging style, she clarifies the distinction between sympathy and empathy and illustrates the idea of an empathetic person putting themselves in the same emotional space as someone who is suffering.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
In the following text, we're going to read a very interesting story about a Jew who excelled at emotional empathy, excelled at actually climbing down into the dark space together with the person that he was trying to assist. Elise, if you can read it for us, please, text 15.
Hey, oops, can't read that. There was an incident concerning a man with a unique custom. Whenever a member of his community would return from the burying of a loved one, this fellow accompanied the mourner home without shoes to share in the pain of the mourner who wasn't wearing shoes as the prescribed expression of intense mourning. When he passed away, it happened to be an occasion for which Jewish communities from the surrounding areas gathered in his city. For the day of his passing was the 9th of Av, the annual day of mourning for the destruction of the temple, when Jews refrained from wearing leather footwear. And so it happened that everyone was without shoes on the day of his death. With this, God publicly demonstrated that he had acted appropriately and admirably, though he had no obligation to act that way.
Thank you, Elise. This is the story of a man who didn't just say, I'm sorry for your loss. He actually felt sorry for their loss. And he shared in their pain, in the pain of every single one of his friends and neighbors, etc., who lost a loved one. And Hashem signaled his approval by orchestrating events so that everyone else should automatically feel his pain as well. Because that's what effective empathy is all about. Emotional empathy is vital for our relationships. It's not just about understanding the perspective of others, which is step one, cognitive empathy, but it's actually about truly feeling the emotions of others, and that's the only way to really, truly have a relationship. We need to be willing to descend with others into the depths of their emotional darkness, if you will. We don't shy away from the shadows, but we actually embrace them. Why? Because when we do this, we forge a bond that is so resilient that can withstand any storm. Okay. Now earlier, we started to talk about some of the challenges that there might be to actually being able to have cognitive or emotional empathy towards someone else. We spoke about the fact that sometimes our own circumstances or will make it difficult for us to feel empathy for someone else. Think about a person who is outraged by the evening news, right? And they're in the middle of letting off steam about it. And now their child falls down on the floor and needs their empathy, needs for them to feel, what they're going through. Or their child comes home from school or home for a play date or whatever it is, and is telling them about some sort of sad story and now needs them to be there with them. That's very difficult, right? Think of somebody who's overwhelmed by work and all their spouse wants is their heir, right? To be able to tell them about their difficult day. Think about someone who's uncertain about a medical result that's coming up, right? Or stressed by some sort of construction. Construction often stresses people out, right? And yet they're trying to actually be there for someone else. Usually what we tend to do is we tend to curl up into ourselves, and hopefully we can avoid hurting other people, right? Which is a whole different issue, that sometimes because we're going through something, we hurt other people. But even if we're not hurting other people, often we have a very difficult time going out of ourselves and being in somebody else's shoes and in somebody else's position and being there for someone else. Yet we know from the example of Joseph that this is possible. It might not be easy to emulate, but we know it's possible and it's something that we can work on. And this brings us back to the importance of the godly soul perspective. You see, the animal soul is naturally apathetic. And that's why when we're in a difficult situation, we find ourselves reverting back to our default state, to the natural animal soul, right? But we should know and we should remember that we have another choice. We can always choose to put on a different pair of glasses, a pair of glasses of the godly soul that is naturally empathetic, and then we can see someone else's perspective. If you're trying to be all animal soul and still somehow be empathetic, you're going against the grain. It's the polar opposite of the animal soul's very nature. But if you're in a godly soul mentality, then automatically it's going to be much easier to be able to put on those glasses and actually be empathetic. Because the godly soul is a naturally empathetic creature. It naturally wants to be outside, wants to turn outwards and be there for someone else. Now, that lays the foundation, right? This shift in paradigm, shift in way of thinking, shift in perspective, that lays the foundation for how to do it. But we also need practical tips, right? So, and if we can combine the attitude together with some practical tips, then we'll really be able to overcome it, right? So here now we are going to bring some practical tips from Brene Brown. Brene Brown discusses something she calls empathy misses. These are basically things that people often say that are clearly not empathetic. Let's
Go ahead.
Let's use a case example. Sorry. Let's use a case example, and then we'll then use all of these different phrases, and you'll see what I mean. Imagine a case of a couple discussing whether and how to address their concerns about a neighbor's disruptive yard work, right? They have a neighbor, the neighbor's got construction going on, and it's hard for them to sleep, and it's hard for them to work, and they have a headache all day, etc. So they're trying to figure out how to deal with it. They find themselves at odds or whether to speak up. The husband says, I'm going to give him a call. I'm going to give the neighbor a call. I'm going to let him have a piece of my mind. Tell him this is horrible. I can't believe what you're doing here, right? The wife says, no, let's let the whole thing go. Not such a big deal. We don't stir the pot. It'll soon be over. We'll just tolerate it for a little longer, and that'll be that. Now, ultimately, the husband ignores his wife's counsel and decides to go to the other room and places a phone call. He calls the neighbor, and the phone call doesn't go as he plans. And as a result, a few minutes later, he comes back to the living room, and he looks shaken. The neighbor, who until now seemed to be a decent friend, responded negatively, was using threatening language and abusive language, etc. And it was a very difficult conversation for the husband. This unfortunate outcome can trigger a whole range of different types of responses from the wife. Here's one option. Boy, I feel bad for you. You will have to find a way to fix this. Does anybody notice how right away this reaction conveys distance? Right? Here's another example. I can't believe you didn't take my advice. I told you so. Right? Here's another example. Gosh, now the neighbor's wife won't jog with me anymore. Very selfish. You see, all of these immediately, these reactions are all about the wife thinking about how this affects her and leaving the husband all alone to deal with whatever it is that he just went through, right? She could say things like, you are to blame for this mess. Let's put on, or here's another example. Let's put on your favorite show so we don't have to think about this. She's not interested in dealing with his emotions, so that's her way of dealing with it. I'm sure we've all done things like that, right? Sometimes we say to our spouse, don't overreact here. We had a much more problematic dispute with Fred a few years ago and it all blew over. I don't want you now to tell me don't overreact, right? Here's another one. Why did you insist on being right instead of being smart? And one more. Let me call him and say it was a big mistake, and let me help you craft your apology. Right? If the wife is human, all of those examples are things that she would say. Why? Because, and even if she doesn't say them, maybe she'll think them. Why? Because they're natural. They come from our animal soul. We immediately just want to curl up inside ourselves. We're not interested in being empathetic in the situation, so that's what happens. Yet, when these types of thoughts dominate our mind, we can choose to not say them, and to push them out of the way. We can choose to repel them. We can choose to realize that that's not empathetic, and that we can choose to have a more empathetic response. So there may be a time for some of these approaches. Right now, that's not the approach. Right now, the most important need is, what is the important need, the immediate need right now? To understand and empathize. Cognitive empathy and effective empathy for the husband. And that's what the wife needs to work on doing, right? And these phrases that we just described, and which you can see on figure 1.3, right? All they bring is sympathy, judgment, disappointment, right? Blame. They're minimizing. They're avoiding the issue. They're comparing it or competing it with other things. They're speaking truth in order to be more powerful. Right? All of these different things. Advice giving and problem solving, that's a big one, right? Instead of listening, it's just, we'll talk much more about that in the lesson about listening. This whole list can be looked at, and you can reflect on whether any of these thoughts cross your mind sometimes when you should really be empathetic towards the other person you're having a relationship with, whether that's your spouse or whether that's anyone else. Once you've identified one of these categories, look at it. It's on page 26. This whole figure of empathy misses, right? Once you can identify some of the ones that you do, you can now work on planning for the future and making sure that you avoid doing it in the next instance in which this knee-jerk reaction, what I would call an animal soul reaction, pops into our mind. We can work on avoiding it and pushing it away, and instead having a more empathetic reaction. But I will warn you that it's going to be difficult to do, and the easiest way to do them is, of course, to have a plan, but also to try and get in tune with your godly soul, to get in tune with your selfless side and your more empathetic side. Because then you're not going against the grain, but you're actually tuning into the natural side of the godly soul. Okay. We are going to skip the concluding exercise, although I do encourage many of you to do it in your own time. It will help you do some intake and reflect on all the different changes that we've done. It's on page 27, this three-part exercise. Sorry, this two-part exercise. And with this, we are going to close our first lesson. And I'd like to call your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 1. The Art of Empathy. 1. At times, we are tempted to attribute relationship success to something beyond our control. However, the Mishnah directs us to acquire a friend, implying that meaningful relationships do not simply happen to us. We can and must make them happen. 2. We each have two souls within ourselves. Our self-oriented soul is naturally apathetic to others, while our godly soul naturally desires to connect with others, sensing itself and others as part of a larger whole. 3. The apathetic animal soul has a firmer grip on the average person's consciousness. Engaging in relationships and friendships requires transcending the animal self, allowing the godly soul to shine. 4. To be in a genuine relationship with another implies being in touch with the divine soul. As such, human connection is not a mere physical or emotional need, but an authentic spiritual experience. 5. The factors that led us into a relationship are not critical. It is common for relationships to begin with self-interest in mind. What is critical is to grow and advance past a self-serving mindset. 6. Cognitive and emotional empathy are crucial for our relationships. Cognitive empathy is the ability to recognize and understand another person's emotions and to communicate this with the other. Effective empathy is experiencing a matching or corresponding emotional reaction to the emotions of another individual. 7. It can be challenging to unleash empathy consistently, especially when preoccupied. The more in tune we are with our godly soul, the easier time we will have in connecting through empathy.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 1 of Nurturing Relationships. This has been The Art of Empathy, and I look forward to seeing you all next week as we continue with lesson 2, The Art of Listening.